Sarvopanishado gavaha dogdha gopalanandanaha Uddhavo vatsalo vatso bhokta cha swayam thada. Srimad Bhagavatam nama Puranam Lokavishrutam Shuruyat Shraddhaya Yuktaha Mama Santosha Karanam. Santosha Karanam. Bhagavatam gives us santosha. The question is, what is santosha? Many times in our day-to-day parlance, when we talk about contentment, many of us would view contentment as something which is possibly negative. In this materialistic world, to be content means to be not really doing well. If somebody says, I am content with my life, then it is looked upon negatively, because contentment is understood as confinement. When what is attained, what is to be attained is material, that possibly is true, because anything which is attained is subject to the law of impermanence. So in that sense, contentment is equated to confinement. But on the spiritual path, contentment is definitely not confinement. Contentment must be looked upon as refinement. Refinement of insight. Refinement of taste. That is why Bhagavatam, the rasa, refines our taste. We start to understand that there is a higher taste that we must cultivate. Tasting worldly pleasures, we get numbed to the real taste. It's like when somebody is eating forever badly tasting food, they do not have a taste for real good food, isn't it? One gets so numb that one cannot really appreciate good taste. Similarly, we are forever tasting something which is very lowly. In that process, we even forget to cultivate our taste. And Bhagavatam helps us to refine our taste. Realize that there is something which is higher. And that taste is what we are actually longing for. That is why Bhagavatam is a rasa shastra. And in that rasa shastra, Uddhava Gita is Adbhuta rasa. Because in Uddhava Gita we see how Krishna takes us through a journey of refinement, step by step. It's such a beautiful journey that we saw how we can look at the entire journey of Uddhava Gita as a journey of a seeker going through multiple stages. In the 11th skanda of Bhagavatam, Uddhava Gita begins from the 7th chapter and goes up to 31st chapter. And so far we have relished 7 chapters of the Uddhava Gita, from 7 to 13. And we have seen how Krishna takes Uddhava and all of us one stage at a time on this beautiful journey, where the journey begins with the very first stage, where the heart is stirred, where Krishna essentially makes us ask the question, how do I move from dependence on nearness to discovery of His presence? This is exactly what Uddhava was told. Nearness is beautiful, but Krishna is always present. So how do I discover his presence wherever I am? Because he is always accessible to me. And that is the beginning of the search of a seeker. Stage 1 is refinement of the heart. Now, as the seeker progresses with the heart refined, now the senses have to be refined. Now, the seeker starts to seek Krishna everywhere in the world. The world becomes a mirror of truth. So, chapters 7, 8, and 9, we saw Avadhuta Gita, where the world becomes a mirror of truth and we learn from the world. Now, learning truth does not complete the journey. The learned truth has to manifest as actions, because ultimately we conduct our lives through our actions. So the learned truth translates into actions, right actions. And therefore stage 3 is offering, the path of offering actions to Krishna. So how do I move from self-centered actions to God-centered actions, to Krishna-centered actions? That is stage 3. That is the refinement of actions. And then the seeker moves to stage 4, refinement of buddhi, intelligence. This is where the question, should I renounce the world or should I engage with the world? That there seems to be a conflict, and Krishna resolves that conflict. One can renounce and still stay engaged. It is about not renouncing the world, it is about renouncing one's ego. We saw the 7 collapses of the ego. And in chapters 12 and 13, Krishna takes us to the heights of philosophy. He narrates Hamsa Gita. Now, from there, we move to the next stage. We move to chapter 14, a fascinating chapter. Now, from the heights of philosophy, now Krishna in this chapter takes up a very interesting topic of inner mastery, the refinement of will. Now, we have seen refinement of heart, refinement of senses, refinement of action, refinement of buddhi. Now we are going to see a refinement of our willpower. The question to ask is, do we have willpower? Only then we can start refining it. Many times we don't even discover there is something called will. Because even though we are choice makers, we are unconscious choice makers. Because our lives are programmed. We all act, behave, and conduct our lives in a very programmed way. Now, from 14th chapter to 18th chapter, Krishna dives deep into this topic of refinement of will. There, Krishna also answers the question, what is yoga? This chapter is philosophical, no doubt, but is very practical too. It is here that we are going to see a beautiful exposition from Krishna on what is dhyana really. How do we practice meditation? So this chapter is where Krishna addresses the question of Uddhava in terms of how, this again goes back to how Krishna concludes chapter 6 and takes chapter 7. Chapter 6, he takes up how one must exercise one's willpower. Uddhared atmanatmanam, atmanam avashadayed. And then, immediately after concluding chapter 6, in chapter 7, Krishna starts Mayasakta manah pata. So, we are going to see how he is going to bring all of this together. The first 6 chapters of the Gita and the next 6 chapters of the Gita combined together, he is going to talk about how are we going to refine the will. Essentially, he's also going to clarify what yoga actually means, because yoga has hundreds of definitions, and especially in today's world, yoga also has become modern, so it also has to get some modern definitions also. Yoga can mean sense control. Yoga is we relate to yoga as controlling myself. We relate to yoga as controlling my desires. We relate to yoga as controlling my thoughts. Most of the definitions of yoga fall in the domain of control. Now, Krishna is going to take us one step further. Now, we need to look at, when we talk about mind control and mind mastery, which Krishna extensively takes up in the 5th and 6th chapter, and eventually in between 7 and 12 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, we look at it from two approaches. One approach is what we can call as using the horizontal force. The other is what we can call as using the vertical force. What are these two forces? What are these two approaches? We must understand how the mind works, mind functions. We say mind is constantly moving. It's constantly wandering. What does it mean? The mind is constantly moving towards the world, which essentially means that it is constantly revolving around a center. And what is the center? The center is that which provides some meaning, some pleasure, some interest, some value. Now the question is, do we have only one center? Unfortunately, no, we have several centers. Therefore, the mind is orbiting around several centers. That is the reason why there is chaos. Now, every center has its own mass. Now, those of us who understand physics, right? Now, whichever object center has a greater mass, that automatically has more gravity. Objects start to revolve around that center which has higher mass. Now, in this case, mass stands for what has greater value, what has greater importance. Now, the mind, therefore, is constantly moving around, orbiting, which essentially means our consciousness is constantly directed, or should I say misdirected. Now, it is oriented and misoriented. Now, Krishna here is going to talk about how do we redirect our consciousness, which essentially means how do I not go with the second approach, not the first approach. First approach is horizontal force, which means I fight with my mind. I try to control it. I try to conquer it. I fight with my thoughts. I fight with my desires. Now, when I fight with my desires, most often I lose. Fighting with my mind is so formidable. It's not easy. It generates friction. The more I fight with my mind, more friction is generated. More fatigue happens. I'm exhausted. A lot of energy is expended in this fight. So therefore, anything that I do trying to control is filled with friction, and it results in fatigue. Now, this approach, therefore, is an approach where success is not guaranteed. And even if we succeed, it is temporary. And all of us have experienced this. So therefore, Krishna talks about how it is not about fighting a desire. We can never win fighting a desire. Then what is the approach? We must outgrow a desire. The only way to manage the desire is not to fight it, but to outgrow it. Now, what does outgrowing a desire mean? This is where the second approach, vertical force, vertical gravity comes in, where we play the game that the mind plays. Because the mind is rotating around a center and it is gravitating towards various centers of different mass. Now, only when we find the right center, and that center which has the greatest mass, we will ensure that the mind starts revolving around the right center. So essentially, this approach is identifying and relocating the center. It is recentering, and what is that recentering? Making Krishna the center of our lives. Because ultimately, he has the greatest mass. He's the mass hero, isn't it? In today's language. So, when we look at it, therefore there are three levels here. Willpower, won't power, want power. The willpower, when we exercise willpower, it is essentially we are expending effort. When we are exercising willpower, we are using our effort. We are using our effort and we are trying to control. Now, then we go to level 2, which is won't power. It's not only expending effort, we are also resisting a temptation, resisting a desire. We are suppressing desires. So this is like trying to conquer the mind by suppressing desires. Here too, most often we fail. We struggle and we fail. Eventually, we need to look at the level 3, which is want power. Want power is, while want power is resistance based, want power is attraction based. This plays to the design of the mind, because the mind gets attracted, and if we get the mind attracted to the source of all attractions, and that attraction would eventually, there no longer push is needed, because there is pull that also works. So therefore, from willpower, we transform to exercising want power, and eventually only the want power works. So it's not just wanting everything or anything, it is wanting the source of all attractions, wanting Krishna. So therefore, yoga is not just willpower. Yoga is not just want power. Yoga is about cultivating want power, wanting Krishna, which essentially means recentering ourselves, finding the right center. Because in our lives, we struggle to find what is the center of our lives. Because why? The center always has to be that which is attached with the highest meaning, highest purpose. Finding that center is the most difficult task. The moment we find that center, and that center happens to be Krishna, then the mind starts to rotate against that center. That is vertical gravity. Now, Krishna is going to talk about, therefore, when we see the journey of our will, refinement of our will, at stage 1 is struggle. Will struggling against the mind, which generates friction. This struggle, if it matures, then the willpower with our will dominate the mind. But even that, trying to dominate the mind, friction may reduce, but fatigue will increase, because it's not easy. It's very challenging. Then we mature to a state where the will realizes its limitation. There is only, our willpower is finite. We do not have infinite willpower. Once our limitation is recognized, that's when we start to become humble. Humility is the doorway to journey further. And then the next stage, will offers itself, which is surrender of our will. We recognize that we have been given a will. Our individual will is meant for only one purpose, to use that will and surrender it eventually, offer it to the Supreme Will. And when that happens, the final stage is complete and total alignment of our will with Krishna's will. So this is the journey of refinement of the will that Krishna is going to take us through. So therefore, when Krishna says, Uddhared Atmanatmanam Atmanam Avasadayet, here, using our will, we have to master the mind. But then, the question is, where is that going to take us to? This approach of control will take us to an extent. But then, true fulfillment will only come when eventually that will is surrendered and aligned to Krishna's will. That is why he starts 7th chapter with Maya Sakta Manah Partha. The direction changes there. And when that direction changes and Krishna becomes the center, then that's when real magic happens. So this is where the journey of refinement of the will is going to, Krishna is going to take us through. Now, the chapter begins very beautifully where Uddhava starts obvious with a beautiful question. He says, Vadanti Krishna Shreyamsi Bahuni Brahmavadinaha Tesham Vikalpa Pradhanyam Utaho Eka Mukhyata. Hey Krishna, Vadanti Shreyamsi Bahuni Brahmavadinaha. Brahmavadi means one who is the seeker of absolute truth. Those who philosophically engage in seeking what is truth, seeking nature of reality. He says, hey Krishna, those who are seeking truth, they seem to be speaking several truths. Truth seems to be not one. Suddenly we get to see different flavors of the truth, and different philosophers seem to be speaking different truths. Bahuni, that they seem to be multiple. And therefore he says, Tesham Vikalpa Pradhanyam Utaho Eka Mukhyata. No, when the means that are prescribed become a lot, then all of a sudden we are overwhelmed. Because sometimes you also ask this question, why do Shastras complicate it? No, they seem to be containing so many possible means, so many ways to practice, so many sadhanas, and there are so many ways reality is explained. Instead of clarifying, many times it confuses us. And this is exactly a challenge for us, any sadhaka. For any sadhaka, the challenge is the abundance of knowledge that is out there, which instead of clarifying, then end up confusing a sadhaka. So Uddhava is rightfully asking on our behalf, Vadanti Krishna Shreyamsi. Shreya means Shreyaha, what is the ultimate good? Now, ultimate good by definition has to be only one, because it's ultimate. But even ultimate good seems to be many. Bahuni Shreyamsi. How can there be? There are two questions here. Are there really multiple ultimate goods? If so, why? This is overwhelming, hey Krishna. He says, Tesham Vikalpa Pradhanyam Utaho Eka Mukhyata. No, if there are so many alternatives, if there are so many options, so many alternatives, so many competing choices, even on the spiritual path, I know, I can understand, when we look at the material world, it is filled with options and choices. Even to buy a packet of chips today, I have a headache because there are 100. The whole row in the supermarket is filled with brands, and I end up coming out what to buy and what not to buy. I thought I will get some peace of mind when I look at, spirituality. Even there, I am bombarded with options now. And therefore, he says, Tesham Vikalpa Pradhanya Mutaho Eka Mukhyata. Is there one primary path? Is there something, Krishna, that you would recommend? One Mukhya, a chief path, Mukhya, with which essentially removes the complexity that I see. Otherwise, even on the spiritual path, I am exhausted. I thought exhaustion is only possible in the material world, but it looks like even when one takes up the spiritual path, there seems to be exhaustion. But Uddhava also knows what Krishna has already recommended before. So he complements what he already raised as a question by giving the answer with a question mark again, essentially seeking further clarification. So the next shloka is very beautiful. He says, Bhavatodahhrita swamin bhakti yogaha anapekshitaha nirasya sarvatah sangam enatpai yavishen manaha. Mayasakta manah partha, Krishna says in the 7th chapter. Now, Uddhava is essentially repeating that. Enatpai avishen manaha. He says, Bhavatodahhrita swamin. Now, he's addressing Krishna as Swami. Again, we must always see how Uddhava addresses Krishna beautifully, because he knows Krishna Swami, he is Dasa. That relationship, understanding that relationship, to be rooted in that relationship is so very important. He says, Bhavataha udahritaha. By you have clearly stated, yes, because unlike Arjuna, who would once again repeat the same question, Krishna would have categorically given an answer. Krishna would have said, hey Arjuna, you must necessarily do your duty, fight the war. Immediately 3 shlokas later, Arjuna says, Krishna, should I really fight the war? As though Krishna has not spoken anything so far. But Uddhava is different. Even when Uddhava asks a question, he says, Krishna, you already told me, but I'm only asking you, just give me a little bit more clarification. That's the difference here in this conversation. He says, you have already stated this. You have already explained, hey Krishna, hey Swamin, that bhakti yogaha anapekshitaha. Why he qualifies bhakti yoga here with anapekshitaha? That sadhana which is not dependent for support on others. Now, when we talk about yoga sadhanas, essentially a yoga sadhana can be looked upon as a technique where there is some effort that needs to be expended, some discipline to be brought in. So it's a combination of effort, discipline, some control, some suppression. Now, all of this put together becomes a sadhana. Now, Bhakti, he says, which is anapekshitaha, which is not supported by any of these techniques. Bhakti yogo anapekshitaha nirasya sarvata sangam. Removing the sangha, the association with everything which is material. Enatpai yavishen manaha. That bhakti yoga is essentially completely getting absorbed in you, that total absorption. Essentially, Uddhava himself is talking about how our mind has 3 destinies. The mind has 3 destinies. Typical destiny is the destiny is the mind as the enemy. The second destiny is mind as a friend. This is where Uddhared Atmanatmanam Atmanam Avasadayet Atmaiva Hyatmavo Bandhuhu Atmaiva Ripuratmanaha. There Krishna is talking, your mind can be your best friend or your worst enemy. 2 destinies are already clearly described here. One destiny is where we are used to, where we are under in the mercy of the mind. Essentially, mind controls everything for us. And wherever it moves, we go. Now, this is where mind is dangerous. It becomes our enemy because we no longer dictate what is the path to be taken, what is the destiny to actually target. The mind determines that. So therefore it is the worst enemy. The second destiny is mind as a good friend. But even when a mind becomes good friend, Krishna is very clear, it is not enough. When will a mind become good friend? When with the right discipline, with the right effort, I start controlling, I start fighting with my desires, and slowly I start conquering my desires. I expend a lot of effort and energy on that, and eventually I try to make an upper hand against my mind. Now, a controlled mind is a good friend, but control will not bring fulfillment. Therefore, the third destiny of the mind should not just become an enemy, nor a friend. Mind must become a lover. That's the destiny. the mind must just fall in love with Krishna. Or, as we say, it must rise in love with Krishna. Essentially, that is total absorption. That absorption in Krishna, which means the center of gravity now is Krishna, and every other center which used to rule the mind slowly and steadily lose their prominence. The mind starts to revolve only around Krishna. And that is where stability, true stability comes in. So here, therefore he says, Bhakti Yogaha Anapekshitaha Nirasya Sarvata Sangha Yenat Yavishen Manaha. That which starts to get absorbed in Krishna, slowly and steadily, the Sangha with everything which is not Krishna automatically dissolve. Now, so therefore Uddhava's question here is essentially, Krishna, can you please clarify? Can you please clarify, is this the process how yoga must progress? Now, Krishna therefore here then he says that is true. And if so, Uddhava's question is, why then there are so many techniques? If this is ultimately what you have recommended, what is Krishna's recommendation? Bhakti yogaha anapekshitaha. This is recommendation. If such is the case, why don't you straight away start? Every Shastra must straight away start with that. There must be nothing else. Why there are so many other sadhanas? Even when people talk about yoga, there are too many ways and means of practicing yoga. More so in today's world. Everybody is discovering their own type of yoga. Yoga is getting branded too. ABC yoga, XYZ yoga. Everybody wants to make money out of yoga. But therefore here, Krishna then says, let me give you a context to why there are so many techniques. He says, at the time of dissolution, now everything gets dissolved, including the body of knowledge. And therefore, when creation begins, Brahma needs to have a manual. And he talks about how Bhagavan himself bestows the entire Shastra, the body of knowledge, Vedas. He is the Veda, and he is the very embodiment of Veda, and he himself gives the body of the Vedas to Brahma. And with the help of that manual, Brahma begins the creation. And all the devatas, different kinds of species are all created. But then with creation also comes variety. Prakriti starts to play. Depending on the modes, natures differ. When natures differ, requirements to deal with different natures also differ. Therefore, because of the changing nature, techniques also change. Because of the differences in nature of beings, the techniques required to be adopted also change. And that is the reason why over a period of time, sadhana is no longer just one. Sadhana becomes multiple in terms of its nature. That's the reason why the Shastras provide a variety of means, and every means seem to be catering to different types of nature, because everybody is conditioned in a particular way, and depending on the conditioning, different means are prescribed. Therefore, techniques seem to be many, but ultimately these many techniques, as they evolve, eventually has to all come together. And Krishna therefore says, Manmaya mohitadiyaha purushaha purusharshapha shreyaha vadanti anekantam yata karma yata ruchi. He says, Manmaya mohitadiyaha. The intelligence is bewildered by my prakriti, my maya. Because of this conditioning by the three gunas, purushaha purusharshabha shreyaha vadanti anekantam. Because of this, Shreyas, the ultimate good, suddenly becomes multiple, many-sided, manifold. Why? Because the intelligence is conditioned by the three gunas. Shreyaha vadanti anekantam yatha karma yatha ruchi. Ruchi also changes according to actions, according to one's nature, according to the conditioning. Therefore, also the prescribed techniques that also change. One who is a ritualist sees ritual as supreme. One who is an ascetic sees renunciation as supreme. One who is a philanthropist sees charity as supreme. A warrior, he sees engaging to fight with honor as the supreme. So the techniques all of a sudden become different, and everybody starts to say, this is Shreyakara, this is the highest good, this is the ultimate good. Then you go, Dharmam yeke yashaschanye kamam satyam dhamam shamam anye vadanti swartham va aishwaryam tyagabhojanam kechid yagyam tapodanam pratani niyamam yamam. Some say dharma is the highest good. Some say yashaschanye, others say fame is the highest good. Kamam, some say pleasure is the highest good. Some say satyam is the highest good. Some say dhamam and shamam, sense control, mind control is the highest good. Some say swartham is the highest good, my own self-interest. Some say aishwaryam, power is ultimate good. Some say tyaga bhojanam, renunciation or regulated enjoyment is the highest good. Some say yajnam tapaha dhanam, sacrifice, austerity, charity is the highest good. Rathani neyamam yamam, some say doing vratas is the highest good. Some say disciplined living is the highest good. Suddenly, what I thought was one good suddenly seems to be multi-branch. If the highest good is multiple, suddenly the techniques also become multiple. And therefore, what Krishna here is saying, he is not saying all of them are not good. He is only exposing all of these are only partial. Because if I perfect in discipline, I reach the goal. Now, therefore, the discipline there not only becomes the tool, discipline also becomes the summit. Krishna says, even that is wrong. And he goes on, he says, what is the limitation of this approach? Limitation of any technique where there is a requirement for control, requirement for exercising willpower and wont power. These are the two. So he explains now. Adyantavanta evaisham lokaah karma vinirmitaah dukkodarah kas tamonishthah kshudra mandah chucharpitaah. He says, Adyantavanta evaisham lokaah karma vinirmitaah. Lokaah karma vinirmitaah. Anything which is produced by technique, a method, where there is an exercise of only willpower, where there is an exercise of only self-effort, it is only a constructed state. And that constructed state is not a long-lasting state. That is not a state of completeness. That's not a state of fulfillment. Why? He says, Dukkodarkas tamonishtaha kshudra mandah shucharpitaah. Ultimately, that constructed state, in a limited sense, in a limited term, may seem to be the destination, but that constructed state is only temporary because it does not help one cross over the ocean of samsara. Now, what is built by effort is bound by time. This is the law. Now, very, very powerful, very profound. What is built by effort is bound by time. So therefore, the corollary to that is, if we need to attain something timeless, which is not bound by time, then our effort is of no use whatsoever. It's a very profound truth which Krishna is going to further explain, because control fails because the center is wrong. Effort fails because the object is wrong. Will fails because the desire is misplaced. So therefore, it's not about trying harder. That is why it is said, by trying harder, we can never do dhyana. Dhyana is not trying harder. The harder we try, the greater we fail. Willpower, exercising willpower, results in not the meditation that the Shastra talks about. So Krishna is very clear. So he says, he's not saying it's wrong. He's saying it's limited by design. We must understand this. It has its limitations. It may be necessary, but not sufficient. That mathematical condition, necessary but not sufficient. Now, always we need to. So that's why he says, Adi antavanta evaisham. They have a beginning and they have an end. It's like different techniques. Now, all of us are wanting ultimately a state where we think Eventually there has to be some realization. Eventually there has to be enlightenment. But many times that state which we call realization or enlightenment, even that state, what is it, is not clearly known. Now, many times yoga sadhana can revolve around breath awareness, can revolve around awareness of body sensations. Various techniques are all used. Ultimately, what Krishna is saying, all of this will take us up to a point. But that point is adhyantavanta evesham. They take us to a point of not completeness, of a point which is still limited. They are all constructed states because they are constructed with our effort, constructed with exercising our willpower and putting in our, and using our want power. These are, so therefore, what Krishna is going to take us to, how do I move from constructed state to an anchored state? Because ultimately, any technique that we use is essentially to still the mind. But a constructed stillness is still constructed stillness. So Krishna is going to take us from a state of constructed stillness to a state of anchored stillness. Now, various techniques of yoga sadhanas, various meditation techniques, if you were to look at, n number of meditation techniques are available today. All of this focus on refining the instrument. What is the instrument? Body, senses, and the mind. Important. But Krishna says refining the instrument is one step. Eventually, one must redefine the center. If I don't redefine the center and keep refining only my instrument, I will still not reach that state of fulfillment. All the techniques train our attention, but they do not transform our attraction. It is not just training our attention, it is also about transforming our attraction. All the techniques reduce disturbance in our mind, but they do not resolve existential restlessness. The fundamental problem that we have is existential restlessness, not just restlessness of the mind, existential restlessness. Therefore, it is about how do I move from just refining the instrument to redefining the center. How do I move from training attention to transforming attraction? How do I move from reducing disturbance of the mind to resolving my existential restlessness? Because ultimately, it is not just making the mind calm. My mind is calm by practicing disciplined, putting in disciplined effort. But does that lead to me a state of true completeness? That's a question that needs to. Krishna says that state is also a state of incompleteness, because any technique generated state is subject to limitation. Where he is leading to is not technique generated, it is relationship grounded absorption. It is relationship ground, which is essentially absorption in Krishna. Therefore, the next shloka beautifully says, Mayarpitatmanas sabhyah nirapekshasya sarvataha mayatmana sukham yattat kutasyat vishayatmanam. Silence can quieten the mind, but it cannot fulfill the heart. I can bring my mind to total silence, total calmness, but my real longing still is not fulfilled. Longing to be eternally loved and longing to ever exist, that longing is still not fulfilled. So silencing and quietening the mind will not fulfill the heart. Steadying the breath can help in attention. It cannot anchor existence. Technique can create stillness of the mind, but we need the infinite to sustain it. The sustaining that stillness requires access to the infinite. Therefore, he says, and what can give that sustenance of that stillness? Bhakti. That's why he says, Mayarpitat manasabhyaha nirapekshasya sarvataha mayatmana sukham yattat kutasyat vishayatmana. Without a higher center, if our life is not recentered, even the most sophisticated meditation remains just a refined arrangement of restlessness. It's just a refined arrangement. Underneath the so-called rest, there will be still existential restlessness. Because why? Because we have still not found the right center. Krishna uses a beautiful phrase here. He says, Mayatmana sukham yattat. Sukha, the source of sukha, real sukha, unless we identify that source, we will still keep seeking. Mayarpitat manasabhya. For one who has offered oneself to me, nirapekshasya sarvataha. Nirapeksha means no expectation. What kind of expectation Krishna is talking about? The seeker has to refine his expectation. I'm not just asking for peace. I'm not just asking for recognition. I'm not just asking for progress. I'm not just asking for some good experience. No, these are all expectations. Because sometimes, I meditate because I want peace. There is already an expectation. I meditate because I want stillness. There is already an expectation. Now, all the nirapekshasya, mayarpitatmanas sabhyaha, without any of this, we don't need to ask for peace. We don't need to ask for a good experience. We don't need to ask for stillness. Now, all those are byproducts. They are not the goals. They are all byproducts. Therefore, he says, Maya, why they are byproducts? Because he says, Mayatmana sukham yattat kutasyat vishayatmana. If one cannot derive sukha from the real source, from where else one can derive? He says, when I am there, the source, the fountainhead of all sukha, whichever source you search for is not going to give you that sukha that you are searching for. So he says, completeness, unless we find that source, we still remain incomplete. We still remain unfulfilled. So how can that ever be attained by those whose consciousness is oriented towards. There are three levels of orientation Krishna is talking about. One level of orientation of the consciousness is orientation on the world outside. We are in a very disturbed state because when the consciousness is oriented towards the world, obviously the world is going to bring a lot of disturbance. Now the second level of orientation is inward orientation, orientation on the self. But that orientation can bring the mind to a state of still. But still, the fulfillment happens when the orientation goes to the self of the self, the Antaryami, the Paramatma, Krishna. That is when real fulfillment happens. And then Krishna says, Na parameshtyam, na mahendra drishnyam, na sarvabhaumam, na rasadhipatyam, na yoga siddhir apunarbhavam va, mayarpitat mechati madvinanyat. One who has offered oneself to me does not desire parameshtya, the highest position in the Brahmanda. One does not desire even the position of Brahma himself. Na mahendra drishnyam, one does not desire the throne of Indra. Na sarvabhaumam, one does not desire sovereignty to rule the earth. Na rasadhipatyam, one does not desire lordship over all the realms. Na yoga siddhihi, now this is very striking. One does not desire even perfection of yoga. Even desiring perfection of yoga, one who has offered oneself to Krishna, na yoga siddhihi. Yoga siddhi is realization here. Realization is essentially, when we call realization, there are several definitions. But what is really simple way of defining realization? It is bringing an alignment between our self-image, who we are, with our actual self, who we truly are. Aligning who we are with truly who we are, our true identity. And that our true identity comes only in our belongingness with Krishna. That only when that belongingness comes in, that is offering ourselves truly to Him. So therefore, enlightenment is not some esoteric state where all of a sudden it's all light and we reach a state where there is nothing. Enlightenment is a state of sweetness, where we are absorbed, we are immersed in Krishna's beauty. It means replacing oneself with Krishna. The center becomes Krishna. Therefore, here says, Na yoga siddhihi apunarbhavam va. Not only yoga siddhi, not even freedom from samsara. One does not even aim for freedom from samsara, which means essentially because even liberation seems as though it is my escape. It is my freedom. Liberation, moksha, is not my escape from samsara. Krishna, one who has offered oneself to Krishna, even that freedom is not anymore desired, because if I get Krishna, I get everything else. So I don't worry about everything else, including my freedom, because my freedom is also subset to my ultimate goal. Therefore, he says, that is the subtle message that Krishna is giving here. He says, therefore, any sadhana is not about control. Any sadhana is not about suppression. Any sadhana is not about willpower. It is not just connection, it is absorption. It is also transforming our attraction. So question is, it's not about whether this technique is useful or not. The real question is this technique that I am adopting, does it change the center of gravity for me? Does my mind now gravitate only around the real center? And only when it finds the right orbit, it really stabilizes. And Uddhava, you have found the right orbit yourself. Krishna is telling Uddhava, therefore, you are very special to me, because Uddhava, you have realized that center, and it is because of that you are very dear to me. He says, Natatha me priyatama atmayo nirna shankaraha nacha sankarshano na shrihi naivatma cha yatha bhavan. We were discussing something similar in our Ramayana quiz course. Here Krishna also says, hey Uddhava, Natata me priyatama atmayo nirna shankaraha. Neither Brahma nor Paramashiva, nacha sankarshanaha. Sankarshana in this case is Balarama. Balarama, Krishna's brother, is Sankarshana. Nacha sankarshana, na Shrihi. Not even Shri, who is always inseparable from me. You are Atma. Nacha sankarshana, na Shrihi. Naivatma cha yatha bhavan. Indeed, you are my very self. Udara sarva evete atmaitu me matam astitasya yuttatma mameva manuttamam gati. As Krishna declares in the Gita, he says, Uddhava, everybody says I am their Paramatma, but for my dearest bhakta, my bhakta is my Atma. This relationship has to be understood. What is the Atma? When we say Atma, Sharira, Shariri Bhava needs to be very clearly understood. For the Sharira, the Jivatma is the Shariri. Now, why this is Shariri? Why the body is Sharira? Who controls? Who sustains? And for who the other exists? The Sharira is controlled by the Shariri. The Sharira is supported by the Shariri. The Sharira exists only for the sake of Shariri. It has no other reason. There is no other utility. Now, the Jivatma is the Shariri of this Sharira, the ultimate Shariri, the Paramatma. The Jivatma is its Sharira. The Jivatma is controlled. The Jivatma exists for and is an utility for the Paramatma. So therefore, but here Krishna says, he reverses that. He says, you my Bhakta, because you control me, you support me, and I am there only for you. This is his Bhakta Vatsalya. Bhagavan is saying, everybody exists only because of me, but I exist only for my Bhakta. Therefore, Natatha me priyatatma atmayo nirna shankaraha nacha sankarshano na shrihi naivatma cha yatha bhavan. So, where he's taking us through this journey now. Now, this, what we discussed, is going to be further, we are going to deep dive into this journey. What is this journey? Willpower against the mind, which creates friction. Stage 1. The second journey is willpower dominating the mind, which creates fatigue. The third stage, willpower. With willpower, we realize our limitation. And then the next stage is the will. With the will, we offer our will. And the final stage is total alignment after the surrender. This is the journey of the refinement of the will And Krishna is going to take us further into this journey, and we'll not only understand mind mastery, we will actually understand how we transform the mind to be the world's best lover. That's the ultimate goal, ultimate destiny of the mind. Sarvam Sri Krishna Arpanamastu.